Hey there, I'm Reverend Jim. This is the whole Bible. Today we're talking about Genesis chapter 16 through 20. Last week was the first half of Abram's story, Abram part 1. This week we are going from Abram to Abraham. We got some name changes going on. Now let's just make sure we know what these names mean. Abram means exalted father, because that's who he was. He was clearly this figure who was had a lot of stuff. We see the stories of him and Lot separating, him coming to Lot's rescue. He wasn't just some dude wandering around with his wife and hoping to have a family. He had some things. He was the exalted father already in this story. But this half, these chapters, is where he becomes the father of multitudes. That's what Abraham means. So Abram, exalted father. Abraham, father of multitudes. You've heard all the descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore and everything else Mufasa said to Simba in that scene from The Lion King.
Look at the stars.
We're getting some of that. So let's take a look. 16 through 20. We got, 5 chapters here. Let's just break them down chapter by chapter so we can know a little bit about what's going on. And then we'll watch 5 Bible in a Minute videos to hear even more about these chapters. And then I'll have some questions for us too. So let's get started with chapter 16. I would call this one Seeing and Survival. This might be one of the best in all the Bible. Of all 1,189 chapters in the whole Bible, Genesis 16. Put it in your top 10 list for sure. It's also one that often gets overlooked in the story of Abraham because we just focus on Abraham. And this is a story about Hagar, an enslaved Egyptian woman who is exploited and cast out by Abraham and Sarah, his wife. Now, there's this whole you're going to have kids promise, and they don't seem to have kids because Abraham and Sarah are getting up there in age. This is the story where they tried to literally take this whole descendant thing into their own hands, and Sarah's like, just sleep with my servant Hagar, and then she can have kids, and then those can be our descendants, which seems weird to us, but that was actually a more common practice in these ancient cultures. So what happens, but then Hagar is cast out. They send her away. This is the great and mighty Father Abraham, and here is a clear blemish on his track record. So, note to self, don't do that. Now, even in her exile, Hagar meets God in the wilderness, and God promises blessings for her and her son. And this is where the story gets even better. Hagar gives God a name. I think she's the only person in the whole Bible who gives God a name. She calls God the one who sees me, making her the first theologian of liberation in the whole Bible. Way to go, Hagar. Genesis 16, definitely an incredible story. It's this nice little subplot line. Takes us out of the normal Abraham storyline and has this rich story filled with meaning and hope. Oh, so good, so good. Then we get chapter 17, covenant and commitment. All right, we're back to that big covenant stuff. And another C word, God reaffirms the covenant with Abraham through the sign of circumcision, renaming Abram and Sarai to mark their new identity. So this is the moment when we go from Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah. And the covenant invites trust not in possession, but in relationship and embodied faithfulness. This is that moment where now the covenant is not just an idea, but it's got a little something going on that makes the descendants of Abraham marked physically that they are his descendants. So there's a lot happening here as well, and covenant is its own whole thing, practice that was often done in ancient cultures. So it's not like something's being invented here, but this is the moment in Abraham's story where the covenant is reaffirmed. So this is kind of that middle point for Abraham with his new name now as well. Chapter 18, this is where the story takes its turn towards what we are a little more used to with Abraham's best hits. Abraham and Sarah welcome some divine visitors who announce the long-awaited birth of a son. They've been waiting. They took matters in their own hands with Hagar. That didn't work. Well, it worked, but then they decided to be horrible people. So this is the moment when these divine visitors, these strangers come, and there's a lot going on here. First, they offer hospitality because that's what you did in these ancient cultures. People are wandering around. You say, let's give you something to eat. Let's give you some rest. So they make a whole meal and they give these strangers hospitality. There's a whole layers here of trust going on and welcome. And that's a message right there, especially in contrast with what's about to happen, because these visitors are on their way to Sodom. Sodom is not the most hospitable place. That's the sin of Sodom, by the way, lack of hospitality towards the foreigner and the stranger and those in need. And so Abraham knows my nephew is in Sodom, so he begins to plead for justice. And this chapter models radical hospitality, moral courage, and faith that questions God for the sake of compassion. This is really that moment of like, wait, God, you can't, how many righteous people need to live there for it to be spared? Basically thinking, how many people are in my nephew's family? So that's where they're headed. And while they're at Abraham's tent, they say, a year from now, your wife's going to have a baby. Hooray. And Sarah hears this and laughs. I'm like 90 years old. That's not going to happen. I missed that window. And then like, why is your wife laughing? Name him Isaac, which means laughter. We're going to get to Isaac in the next video. So we'll stick here. Chapter 18, hospitality and hope. We got some hope for the future of Abraham's family and maybe some hope for the fate of Sodom. Let's see. Genesis 19, violence and vulnerability. Oh, so this is Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction. Now, people often look at this and say, see, it's all about homosexuality. No, it's not all about homosexuality. This destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah exposes the dangers of systemic violence and inhospitality, not sexual orientation. The sin of Sodom, you'll read in Ezekiel this, says that the sin of Sodom is lack of hospitality. Here's what it actually says. So in this chapter, Lot's family survives by divine mercy. They are led out of the city by these strangers. The story's complicated. You should definitely read it and wrestle with the reality of it. But for the sake of the narrative, Lot's family escapes. There's the moment in this story where Lot's wife turns back to look at the destruction, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. Now, this is a good reminder, myth and legend. First 10 chapters of Genesis are myth. The rest of the book of Genesis is legend. These are legendary stories. We're not trying to find some documented, objective, historical, this is how it happened if you had your iPhone to film it kind of truth. This is, the whole Bible's true, and some of it even happened. So you can figure out which parts might have actually happened. That's chapter 19, violence, vulnerability. Whew. All right, one more here. Chapter 20 is deception and deliverance. Abraham's story has an interesting turn here, where Abraham again endangers Sarah by calling her his sister, repeating old patterns of fear and control. They are off in an area, they're not in their promised land yet. They don't have their space. They're kind of nomadic and wandering, and there's this fear of, wait, this ruler, he's going to think I'm a threat, so let's pretend you're my sister, not my wife, and it becomes a whole thing where the ruler says, well, then I'll take her as mine, and we had this happen last video. So Abraham, come on. And here's the really interesting thing. We're going to have this all happen again with some of Abraham's descendants. We have a cyclical nature of storytelling here. That's the important thing. It's not cyclical history, it's cyclical storytelling. So this has a moment where even through human failure, God protects the vulnerable, reaffirms the promise. They end up working it all out. The video in a minute here will explain it a bit more. But this is just one of those chapters. I just want to point out that it's once again echoing back to an earlier moment in Abraham's story, and it's happening again. So there they are, 5 chapters. Now let's take 5 minutes. Let's hear these 5 fantastic theologians offer their thoughts on these chapters.
Bible in a minute. Genesis, chapter 16. In this chapter, Sarai and Abram discover that they are unable to have children, and so Sarai gives her slave, Hagar, to Abram to use as a surrogate. Hagar conceives and loathes her mistress, and Sarai in turn turns her anger back to Abram, and Hagar flees. But in the wilderness, an angel of God appeared to Hagar, urged her to return to Sarai, saying, "Your offspring will outnumber the stars, and it will all start with this child, Ishmael." And Hagar gives God a name, saying, "You are El Roi, the God who sees me." And so Hagar becomes the very first and only person in the Hebrew Bible to give God a name. She, a slave woman, teaches us that those who suffer injustice are often messengers from God.
Bible in a minute, Genesis chapter 17. This is a chapter where God creates a covenant of circumcision, everyone's favorite part of the Bible. This is a covenant between God and Abraham for every male who is 8 days old, and God says if a boy is not circumcised, he should be cut off from the people. This chapter is unique, and this covenant is strange. It's really intended to be a way to separate the Hebrew people from the communities that surround them, to mark them as distinct before God. And in this patriarchal culture, men represent everyone, so they're the only ones that have to have this mark done to them. The redemptive point of this scripture is that whether or not we adhere to circumcision, it evokes a question that many Christians ask every Lent. What are we willing to give up in order to be closer to God? Are we willing to be intentionally uncomfortable as we follow Jesus and do what is right? This is always a question worth pondering.
Bible in a Minute, Genesis 18. Some mysterious visitors appear at Abraham's tent with an earth-shattering message. Sarah will give birth to a son. This is to fulfill God's promise that this couple will be the origin of a great nation. But there's just one huge problem with this promise. This couple is old. Sarah is postmenopausal, so when she receives the news that she's going to have a baby, she laughs. Who wouldn't? Our culture abounds with negative stereotypes of old age as a time of boredom or stagnation or just reliving the glory days. This chapter points in a very different direction, depicting old age as a time of new life and surprise, sexual pleasure and laughter, and an ever-evolving faith. The horizons of hope expand for Sarah and Abraham as they age. And maybe they can expand for us too as we age.
Bible in a Minute, Genesis 19. Lot protects 2 male angels he has invited into his home. Men of the town seek to humiliate Lot's guests as raping a man is the ultimate degradation. Women were disposable, so Lot's instinct is to discard his virgin daughters to the crowd at the cost of saving the strangers. Also not surprising that Lot's daughters would conceive children by their father in order to increase their worth. In the books Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zephaniah, and more, Sodom and Gomorrah are described as oppressive, arrogant, and abusing their power. This chapter focuses on a forsaken place and people so wicked that not even 10 decent people could be found to save it. The real sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is hostile welcome, and the implication that this chapter has anything to do with consensual same-sex relationships is completely false. We can change that narrative. Lives depend on it.
Bible in a Minute, Genesis chapter 20. Sometimes I'm convinced that the Bible is a soap opera. Abraham and Sarah are traveling. They arrive in Gerar, and Abraham is afraid that the king will kill him and take his wife, so he passes her off as his sister. King Abimelech takes her anyway. Really, this whole sister charade only served to protect Abraham's life. Now God is pissed because Abraham is God's current favorite, and God doesn't want some random king taking his favorite's wife, and so naturally God threatens to kill the king, and God closes fast the wombs of the house of Abimelech. Abimelech defends himself, pleading innocence since Abraham had introduced Sarah as his sister rather than his wife. God says, send her back, or you and your whole family will die. Okay, God, maybe tone down the death threats a bit. Abimelech calls for Abraham and asks him, what were you thinking? Abraham explains the whole thing. I thought you would kill me, and they end up working it all out. But still, talk about unnecessary drama. Moral of the story, if that's even possible, don't tell people your spouse is your sibling. And if you're God, cool it with the death threats. All right, so what stands out to you? What do you notice? Notice what you notice. That's always a good rule of life. Just pay attention to what surfaces as you are experiencing things like the Bible. And then here's some specific questions. What does it mean to be seen by God when the world overlooks and mistreats you? Thinking of the Hagar story specifically. How does Sarah's laugh reflect both skepticism and hope? That's a lot of our world today, skepticism and hope. And how does this reframe the common misunderstanding of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah when you think about it through the lenses we talked about in this video and the Bible in a Minute video as well? Okay, next week we're back with more. We are getting to know Abraham's son Isaac. So go read some Bible and I'll see you then.